Blue Gate isn't just another location on the map in Ark Raiders. It's a mass grave where thousands of mechanized war machines met their end in the most catastrophic battle humanity ever witnessed against the Ark. And what you're about to discover will completely change how you see this game's universe. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now let's talk about what Blue Gate actually is, because most players run through this area without understanding they're standing on top of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Blue Gate is a mountainous region that looks peaceful from a distance with its small towns and winding tunnels, but underneath all that natural beauty lies an underground network of facilities that were built for one purpose: to stop the Ark invasion at any cost. The name Blue Gate comes from the massive energy barrier that humanity constructed across the mountain passes, a shimmering blue wall of electromagnetic force that was supposed to be impenetrable. The barrier wasn't just some defensive wall, it was the culmination of decades of research into Ark technology, essentially using the enemy's own power against them. Scientists had discovered that Ark machines operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies, and by generating a counter-frequency at extreme amplitudes, they could theoretically shut down any Ark unit that came within range. The project cost more money than most countries' entire GDP, required the forced relocation of 40,000 civilians, and took 8 years to complete. When it was finally activated in 2041, the blue light could be seen from space, a beacon of human defiance against the mechanical swarm. For 3 months, Blue Gate held perfectly. Ark scouts would approach the barrier and simply drop from the sky like their strings had been cut. Larger units would grind to a halt, their systems overloading and frying from the inside out. Military leadership called it humanity's greatest victory. Politicians gave speeches about turning the tide, and civilians started believing we might actually win this war. The towns around Blue Gate grew as people moved closer to the barrier, thinking it was the safest place on Earth. Markets opened, schools were built, families planted gardens. Life almost felt normal again, but the Ark weren't stupid, they were learning. Every machine that fell at Blue Gate sent data back to the collective intelligence. Thousands of failures analysed and processed. The Ark were doing what they do best: adapting. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning when sensor technicians noticed the barrier's power consumption had spiked by 15%. Engineers checked every system and found nothing wrong, so they wrote it off as a calibration error. 2 days later, another spike, this time 20%. The barrier was working harder to maintain the same level of protection, like it was pushing against increased resistance. By the end of the week, power consumption had doubled. Scientists started panicking because the pattern was clear. The Ark were testing the barrier's limits, probing for weaknesses, and they were doing it in a way that showed frightening intelligence. The Ark began sending waves of disposable units at the barrier, cheap scouts and drones that served no tactical purpose except to die. Hundreds of them every hour, just throwing themselves at the blue wall. Command thought it was desperation, a last desperate attempt to overwhelm the defences through sheer numbers. They were wrong. Each unit that died at the barrier carried slightly modified shielding, different electromagnetic configurations, testing combinations. The Ark were running experiments, using their own soldiers as data points in a massive computational problem. And then they found the answer. On November 14th, the Ark launched what looks like another standard probe, 50 units approaching from the north. Barrier technicians barely looked up from their coffee. The machines hit the blue wall and the entire electromagnetic field collapsed in 1.3 seconds. Not damaged, not weakened, completely gone. The Ark had found the exact frequency pattern that caused a cascading failure in the barrier's generation network. Before anyone could process what happened, the real attack began. The Ark had been massing forces just beyond sensor range for weeks, thousands of machines waiting in the mountain valleys. When the barrier fell, they came through like a flood. Witnesses said the sky turned black with flying units, the ground shook from the weight of heavy assault machines, and the noise was like standing inside a jet engine. Blue Gate's defensive forces were substantial. 70,000 troops, artillery positions, air support, underground bunkers stocked for a year-long siege. None of it mattered. The Ark had planned this assault specifically to make an example of humanity's greatest defensive achievement. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to crush any hope the barrier had created. The first town fell in 18 minutes. The Ark didn't occupy it, they erased it, reducing every building to rubble with methodical precision. Civilians who ran were cut down by scout units. Those who hid were found by sensor sweeps and eliminated. The Ark weren't taking prisoners. They weren't harvesting resources. They were sending a message. Military units tried to form defensive lines, but the Ark had studied human tactics at Blue Gate for months. Every fallback position, every choke point, every ambush site had been mapped and countered. It was like fighting an enemy that knew every move before you made it. Artillery proved useless because Ark jamming systems turned guided munitions into expensive fireworks, and unguided shots were avoided with ease. Air support lasted 20 minutes before Ark anti-air units established complete aerial denial, shooting down planes with accuracy that seemed impossible. Underground bunkers became tombs as Ark breacher units, machines specifically designed for penetrating fortified positions, cut through blast doors like cardboard. Soldiers who had trained for years found themselves fighting in pitch-black tunnels against enemies that could see perfectly in the dark that never got tired, never felt fear, and never stopped coming. The battle lasted 6 days. Command kept sending reinforcements because abandoning Blue Gate meant abandoning the entire northern defensive line, which meant losing access to critical resources and population centres. Fresh troops would arrive, march into the meat grinder, and disappear. Communication became sporadic as Ark jammers blanketed the region, then stopped entirely. Satellite imagery showed the blue light of the barrier was gone, replaced by orange flames that burned day and night. On the 7th day, a single helicopter managed to escape the combat zone, carrying 12 survivors out of 70,000 deployed troops. The pilot reported that Blue Gate no longer existed as a recognizable location. The mountains had been reshaped by explosives, the towns were craters, and the underground facilities had been systematically collapsed. But the worst part, or the part that made Command go silent when they heard it, was what the Ark had done with their own fallen units. The machines that had been destroyed in the battle, and there were thousands of them because humanity had fought hard, hadn't been left where they fell. The Ark had gathered every destroyed unit into massive piles in the centre of what used to be the main town square. Witnesses described pyramids of broken metal 50 feet high, testament to the cost of this victory even for the machines. But this wasn't a burial or disposal, it was a statement. The Ark was showing humanity that they could afford these losses, that destroying thousands of their units meant nothing because they could build thousands more. When salvage teams finally entered Blue Gate 3 months later, they found a landscape that looked like an alien planet. The electromagnetic barrier generators had been dismantled down to the component level, with Ark units clearly having studied the technology before destroying it. The small towns were gone so completely that you couldn't tell where streets had been. Trees were shattered stumps, the ground was churned dirt mixed with metal fragments, and the smell, survivors said, the smell of burnt electronics mixed with decay, hung in the air like fog. The underground facilities told the most disturbing story. These weren't just collapsed tunnels. The Ark had methodically explored every passage, every room, every storage area before demolition. Salvage teams found Ark claw marks on walls deep inside complexes that were supposedly secret, proving the machines had detailed intelligence about the base layout. In some rooms, they found human defensive positions exactly as they'd been abandoned, weapons still pointed at doorways where ARC units had come through. The bodies were gone though, all of them. Not buried, not burned, simply removed. To this day, nobody knows why the ARC took human remains from Blue Gate, and the theories range from studying human biology to something far worse. But it's the machine graveyard that gives Blue Gate its reputation in ARC raiders. Those pyramids of destroyed ARC units are still there, rusting and weather-worn, but intact. The ARC never came back to collect their fallen, never recycled the materials, never cleared the battlefield. Players exploring Blue Gate will find these massive cairns of broken machines scattered throughout the region, some partially buried, others standing like monuments. Each pile contains hundreds of units, crushed harvesters, shattered flyers, broken combat chassis, all stacked with geometric precision. Engineers who've studied the piles say the ARC arranged their destroyed units in patterns that might be mathematical formulas, the spacing and orientation of each wreck following rules we don't understand. Some researchers think it's a form of communication, a message left in metal for whoever finds it. Others believe it's simpler, a graveyard marker showing respect for fallen warriors. The most disturbing theory suggests the piles are warnings, the ARC showing future generations what happens when you resist. Walking through the machine graveyard affects people differently. Some players report feeling watched, like the broken machines are still somehow aware. Others describe a heavy silence, the absence of wildlife, and wind creating dead zones where sound doesn't carry right. A few claim their equipment malfunctions near the larger piles, compasses spinning, electronics glitching, batteries draining faster than they should. Official explanations blame residual electromagnetic interference from the old barrier generators, but that doesn't account for reports of machines that seem to have moved between visits. Wrecks found in different positions than survey photos show. The underground complexes beneath Blue Gate are even stranger. Most are collapsed or flooded, but some tunnels remain accessible, leading deep into the mountain. These passages were built as emergency fallback positions, reinforced bunkers where defenders could retreat if the surface was overrun. They're filled with abandoned equipment, emergency supplies that nobody lived to use, and walls covered in messages scratched by dying soldiers. Players exploring these tunnels find rooms that look like they were left in a hurry. Half-eaten meals still on tables, weapons disassembled for cleaning and never finished, personal photos scattered on bunks. But there's no blood, no bodies, no physical evidence of what happened to the people stationed here. The ARC's thorough removal of human remains creates gaps in the historical record that drive researchers crazy. The deeper tunnels connect to the barrier generator facilities, massive chambers that once housed the electromagnetic projectors. These rooms are cathedral-sized spaces carved from solid rock, now home to the shattered remains of humanity's most advanced technology. The generators themselves were partially dismantled by ARC units, key components removed with surgical precision, while other parts were smashed beyond recognition. Scientists studying the damage say the ARC knew exactly which pieces to take, suggesting they understood the technology better than the humans who built it. Some generator chambers show evidence of ARC occupation, areas where machines apparently set up temporary installations for purposes unknown. Scorch marks on the walls form patterns that might be writing or might be random, equipment arrangements that could be deliberate or could be coincidence. The ambiguity is maddening because it suggests ARC behavior that goes beyond simple combat programming, something that looks almost like curiosity or study. One chamber contains what researchers call the archive wall, a section of rock face where someone, human or machine, carved thousands of serial numbers. Each number corresponds to an ARC unit destroyed in the Blue Gate battle, a complete catalogue of machine casualties listed with bureaucratic precision. Nobody knows who made this list or why, human survivors accounting for enemy losses, or ARC units recording their own dead. The numbers are carved too perfectly for human tools, each digit exactly the same depth and width, but the act of recording fallen individuals seems too emotional for machines. Environmental conditions at Blue Gate have changed since the battle in ways that scientists struggle to explain. The region experiences electromagnetic anomalies that make navigation difficult. Compass needles swing randomly. GPS systems give impossible coordinates. Radio transmissions become garbled with static that sometimes sounds like voices. Local wildlife refuses to enter certain areas, creating dead zones where even insects are absent. Plants grow in strange patterns around the machine piles, twisted shapes that don't match natural growth, but aren't obviously artificial either. Some researchers believe the barrier generators damaged the local environment in ways we don't understand, that years of high-intensity electromagnetic radiation altered fundamental properties of matter in the region. Others think the Ark did something to Blue Gate, left behind technology or effects that continue operating years after the battle. The most radical theory suggests Blue Gate exists in multiple states simultaneously, that the barrier collapse created a kind of scar in reality where past and present overlap. Evidence for this comes from reports by salvage teams and players who claim to see things that shouldn't be there. Flickers of blue light in the distance where the barrier used to stand. Sounds of gunfire and explosions that fade when approached. Shadows moving through ruined buildings in patterns that look like patrol routes. These experiences are dismissed as stress or imagination, but they happen too consistently to ignore completely. Multiple independent witnesses describe the same phenomena, seeing the same phantom lights, hearing the same ghostly battles. The Ark's behaviour after Blue Gate also raises questions. Having achieved total victory and demonstrated the futility of human resistance, the machines didn't press their advantage. They didn't push south into the now undefended territories, didn't exploit the gap in humanity's lines. Instead, Ark forces withdrew from the region entirely, pulling back beyond the mountain ranges and leaving Blue Gate as an empty wasteland. This retreat made no tactical sense, and Command spent months expecting a follow-up attack that never came. Some analysts think the Ark achieved their objective, which wasn't territorial gain, but psychological victory. By crushing humanity's greatest defensive achievement, they broke the will to build similar installations elsewhere. Others believe the Ark withdrew because they got what they came for: technology samples from the barrier generators or data about human defensive capabilities. A minority opinion suggests the Ark left because something about Blue Gate disturbed even them, that whatever happened in those 6 days of battle created conditions that made the machines uncomfortable. The machine graveyard itself might be evidence of this, the Ark abandoning thousands of units rather than salvaging them, suggesting they wanted nothing more from the site. In Ark Raiders gameplay, Blue Gate serves multiple functions. It's a high-risk area where powerful Ark units still patrol, remnants of the invasion force that never received withdrawal orders. It's a source of rare salvage, the destroyed machines containing components and materials unavailable anywhere else. And it's a piece of living history, a place where players can see the physical evidence of humanity's greatest defeat. The environmental design reinforces the tragedy. Ruined towns where you can still identify individual buildings, playgrounds where children used to play, shops that once sold everyday goods. The contrast between the peaceful mountain setting and the violence that occurred here creates emotional weight that pure gameplay can't match. Players walking through Blue Gate experience environmental storytelling at its best, every crater and bullet hole contributing to a larger narrative. The underground sections amplify this effect, moving through tunnels where desperate soldiers made their last stand, reading messages they scratched on walls, finding their weapons and equipment left exactly as they fell. Some locations in Blue Gate have become landmarks for the player community. The Shattered Gate is the remains of the main barrier generator, a structure the size of a skyscraper now lying in pieces across a valley. Players gather here for events and challenges, using the wreckage as an arena. The Iron Garden is a machine graveyard where Ark units are arranged in almost artistic patterns, creating a maze of rusted metal that's both beautiful and horrifying. The echo tunnels are underground passages where sound behaves strangely, whispers carrying for miles while shouts are swallowed by silence. Each landmark has stories attached, player experiences, and discoveries that add layers to the official lore. The community has documented hundreds of details that developers never explicitly confirmed, finding connections and patterns in the environmental design that suggest deeper narratives. Some players dedicate themselves to cataloguing every serial number on the archive wall, cross-referencing them with Ark unit databases to identify specific machines. Others map the underground tunnel networks, discovering sealed sections and hidden chambers that might contain secrets. A few focus on the electromagnetic anomalies, measuring field strengths and mapping fluctuation patterns to test theories about residual barrier effects. This player-driven investigation turns Blue Gate from a static game location into an evolving mystery, with new discoveries changing how the community understands the lore. The Ark's perspective on Blue Gate remains unknown because machines don't communicate their motivations to humans. We don't know if the Ark saw this as an important victory or a minor engagement, whether destroying the barrier was strategic necessity or personal vendetta. The machine graveyard suggests the Ark consider their fallen worth acknowledging somehow, but we can't interpret the meaning behind those geometric pile arrangements. Maybe each pyramid represents a specific unit group that fought together. Maybe the patterns encode battle data, or maybe it's purely functional and we're seeing significance in randomness. What's certain is that Blue Gate changed the course of the war, proving that static defenses were useless against an enemy that could learn and adapt. After Blue Gate, humanity abandoned large-scale barrier projects in favor of mobile tactics and guerrilla warfare. The defensive doctrine shifted from holding territory to surviving long enough to learn Ark weaknesses. In that sense, Blue Gate's sacrifice bought knowledge with blood, teaching lessons that would inform human resistance for years to come. The soldiers who died there didn't die for nothing. Their failure showed what didn't work and forced strategic innovation. For players in Ark Raiders, Blue Gate represents the stakes of this conflict. This isn't a game about heroic victories and triumphant battles. It's about survival in a war where losing against an enemy we don't understand. Walking through the machine graveyard reminds us that the Ark can be beaten, that they leave behind wreckage and failures, but it also shows the cost of human resistance measured in ghost towns and empty tunnels. The emotional impact comes from the contrast, seeing evidence of normal life interrupted violently, families displaced, communities erased, defenders overwhelmed despite fighting desperately. The Blue Gate Massacre, because that's what it was despite military terminology trying to soften it, stands as the worst single defeat in the Ark War. Worse than the fall of Singapore, worse than the Moscow encirclement, worse even than the Sydney Harbour disaster. 70,000 troops killed in 6 days, 40,000 civilians dead or missing, an entire defensive line collapsed, and nothing gained except the knowledge that our best wasn't good enough. Historians mark Blue Gate as the moment humanity stopped believing we could win the war, the point where strategic objectives changed from victory to survival. The psychological damage exceeded the material losses. Soldiers across all fronts heard what happened and morale dropped measurably. Recruitment numbers fell and desertion rates spiked. The Ark had proven they could take our greatest achievement and turn it into a graveyard, and that realization broke something fundamental in the human war effort. Recovery took years, rebuilding defensive lines, restoring supply routes, convincing civilians that resistance still mattered. The survivors of Blue Gate, that handful of people who escaped the massacre, became important voices in this recovery, speaking publicly about their experiences not to glorify the battle, but to honor the fallen and contextualize the defeat. They described soldiers who fought knowing they were going to die, who held positions long after retreat was impossible, who used their last ammunition to buy minutes for comrades who might escape. These stories of desperate courage helped transform Blue Gate from a symbol of failure into something more complex, a reminder that humanity's strength lies not in our technology or defences, but in our refusal to give up even when defeat is certain. The machine graveyard itself became a memorial site, preserved by mutual agreement between human survivors and ARC forces who never returned to the region. Families of the fallen make pilgrimages to Blue Gate, searching for closure in the ruins where their loved ones died. They leave markers and tributes, photos and letters, personal items that accumulate in sheltered spots throughout the site. Players exploring Blue Gate sometimes encounter these real-world memorials mixed into the game environment, creating moments where fiction and reality blur uncomfortably. The developers made a deliberate choice to include these elements, showing respect for the tragedy while using it to enhance narrative impact. Some critics argue this crosses ethical lines, turning real suffering into entertainment, but others counter that remembering is never wrong, and games can be valid vehicles for memorial. The debate continues in player communities, with some treating Blue Gate as sacred ground, deserving reverence, while others see it as just another game map to exploit for resources. This tension reflects broader questions about how we process trauma through media, whether interactive experiences trivialize suffering or create deeper understanding through participation. Blue Gate forces these questions because it doesn't present the massacre as background lore mentioned briefly in a text log. It makes players walk through the aftermath, climb over machine wrecks, explore bunkers where people died, engage directly with the physical evidence. You can't ignore what happened here, because the environment won't let you. Every vista shows destruction. Every structure tells a story of violence. Every quiet moment reminds you that this place should be full of life, and isn't. The game doesn't provide easy answers or redemptive narratives. Blue Gate isn't a level you complete to unlock a happy ending. It's just there, permanent and unchanging, a scar on the landscape and a weight on the player's experience. What really happened at Blue Gate is simpler than conspiracy theories or hidden secrets. Humanity built something magnificent, and the ARC destroyed it, killing tens of thousands in the process and proving that our technology couldn't protect us. The machine graveyard exists because even the ARC paid a price for this victory, losing thousands of units in 6 days of combat. But unlike human losses, these machines can be replaced, rebuilt, redeployed. The asymmetry is crushing. We lose soldiers who can never be replaced, while they lose units that can be manufactured endlessly. Blue Gate demonstrates this fundamental imbalance, shows why humanity is losing despite individual courage and tactical skill, because we're fighting an enemy that treats casualties as acceptable overhead while we mourn every loss. The ARC don't need to win every battle, they just need to outlast us, grind us down through attrition until there's nobody left to resist. Blue Gate was supposed to prevent this, create a sanctuary where humans could gather strength and resources for a counteroffensive, but it became instead a demonstration of futility, proof that no defense is permanent against an enemy that learns. The barrier fell because the ARC studied it until they understood it, then applied that understanding to create a targeted solution. This is how they win, through patient analysis and adaptive response, treating each human innovation as a problem to solve rather than an obstacle to fear. We build walls and they learn to breach them. We develop weapons and they develop counters. We create strategies and they evolve tactics, always one step ahead because they share information instantly across their entire force, while we struggle with communication and coordination. Blue Gate shows this dynamic in miniature. 3 months of successful defense followed by catastrophic failure once the ARC finished their analysis. The survivors talk about this, the creeping realization during those final weeks that something was wrong, that the ARC were preparing something, but being unable to stop it because they didn't understand what was coming. Even if they'd known the exact nature of the attack, the frequency pattern that would collapse the barrier, there was no time to redesign and rebuild the entire system. The Ark's timeline for learning and adapting was shorter than humanity's timeline for recognizing the threat and responding, leaving defenders helpless to prevent the inevitable. This is the real horror of Blue Gate, not the violence itself, but the helplessness, knowing you're about to be destroyed and being unable to stop it despite every effort and resource. The machine graveyard preserves this moment, freezing the aftermath of human failure in metal and rust, creating a permanent record that says we tried and it wasn't enough. The Ark could have removed these piles, could have salvaged the materials or erased evidence of the battle, but they chose to leave them standing, and that choice suggests intentions we can't fully grasp because machine logic doesn't work like human thinking, doesn't value the same things, or prioritize the same outcomes. When salvage teams first surveyed the machine graveyard, they expected to find valuable technology, intact Ark components they could study or reverse engineer. But what they discovered was disappointment because the Ark had already stripped anything useful from their fallen units before arranging them into those geometric piles. Every power core was removed, every processing unit extracted, every weapon system dismantled, leaving only structural frames and housings. The metal skeletons of machines picked clean of anything that made them functional. This selective salvage proved the Ark weren't abandoning resources carelessly. They took what mattered and left what didn't, which means the piles serve a purpose beyond simple disposal. Research teams have spent years studying the arrangement patterns, measuring distances between wrecks, analysing the types of units grouped together, looking for meaning in the data. Some patterns are obvious, like how flying units are stacked separately from ground units, or how larger chassis form the bases of pyramids, while smaller scouts fill the upper sections. Other patterns are subtle, ratios between pile heights and base diameters that match mathematical constants, orientations that align with magnetic north or celestial bodies, structural reinforcements that suggest the piles were built to last. The Ark invested time and effort into creating these monuments, which contradicts the idea of machines as purely functional entities without aesthetic or memorial impulses. Unless the piles serve functions we haven't identified, broadcasting signals or storing data or marking territory in ways our sensors can't detect. Equipment malfunctions near the larger piles support this theory, suggesting active technology embedded in structures that look like inert wreckage. Players who spend extended time in the machine graveyard report their gear behaving strangely, motion sensors triggering without visible cause, thermal imaging showing heat signatures that disappear when approached, audio pickups recording sounds that shouldn't exist in an abandoned battlefield. Developers claim these effects are intentional gameplay elements, environmental hazards that increase difficulty and create atmosphere. But the specific nature of the glitches, the way they seem responsive rather than random, makes some players wonder if there's more to it. The Ark are known for using unconventional technology, energy systems, and computational methods that don't match human understanding, so it's possible their wrecks retain functionality even after apparent destruction, operating in dormant or reduced states that our instruments barely register. The echo tunnels provide the clearest evidence of ongoing Ark activity at Blue Gate. Those underground passages where sound propagates impossibly, carrying whispers for miles while absorbing shouts completely. Acoustic engineers have tested the tunnels extensively, trying to explain the phenomena through natural geology or architectural acoustics, but the patterns don't match any known physical principles. Sound waves behave differently in different sections of the same tunnel, following rules that change without apparent cause, creating zones where communication is enhanced and others where it's suppressed. Some researchers think the Ark modified the tunnel structure during their occupation, installing materials or devices that manipulate sound waves for purposes we can only guess at. Others believe the barrier generators affected the rock itself, that years of electromagnetic radiation altered molecular structures in ways that changed acoustic properties. The most unsettling explanation comes from survivors who were in the tunnels during the battle, who claim the Ark used sonic weapons that could shatter concrete and rupture organs, weapons that might have left residual effects in the environment. These survivors describe sounds that felt solid, pressure waves that hit like physical impacts, frequencies that induced panic or paralysis or disorientation in human targets while leaving machines unaffected. If such weapons existed and were used extensively in the echo tunnels, the rock might carry imprints of those frequencies, echoes of violence that persist years later and manifest as acoustic anomalies. Players exploring the tunnels sometimes hear sounds that shouldn't be there, footsteps behind them when they're alone, voices calling from side passages, mechanical noises that fade when investigated. Developers say these are ambient audio files designed to create tension, random sounds triggered by player proximity to maintain atmosphere. But the specific content of some sounds, phrases in languages players recognize, names that match real people, details too specific to be coincidental, suggests something more complex. The community has documented hundreds of these anomalous sounds, cataloguing them by location and content, looking for patterns. What they've found is disturbing. The same phrases repeat in different areas, suggesting intentional placement rather than random generation. And some phrases appear to be messages, warnings, or pleas that don't fit the game's official narrative. One frequently reported sound is a voice saying, "coordinates," a string of numbers that, when entered into mapping software, point to a location in Blue Gate's underground network that doesn't appear on any official map. Players who've tried to reach this location report dead ends and collapsed tunnels, but a few claim to have found passages that lead deeper than the mapped areas into sections that might predate the barrier project or might have been built by the Ark during their occupation. These deep tunnels allegedly contain things that don't belong, equipment that isn't human or Ark, markings in unknown languages, architectural styles that match neither side's construction methods. The developers deny these areas exist, calling them glitches or misinterpreted terrain features, but players keep reporting them with consistent details that suggest shared experiences of real locations. The mystery deepens with the archive wall, that chamber where thousands of Ark serial numbers are carved with inhuman precision. Researchers have identified most of the numbers, matching them to specific Ark units documented in battle records, confirming the list represents actual machines destroyed at Blue Gate. But some numbers don't match any known Ark designation, using formats and prefixes that don't appear in human databases, suggesting either gaps in our knowledge of Ark unit classification or the presence of machine types we've never encountered. A small percentage of numbers on the wall aren't Ark serial codes at all. They're human military identification numbers, service tags belonging to soldiers who died at Blue Gate. These human numbers are carved in the same style and precision as the Ark codes, indistinguishable in execution, raising questions about who created the archive wall and what it represents. If humans made it, why include Ark serial numbers with such detail and accuracy? And how did they achieve machine-level precision in the carving? If Ark units made it, why include human casualties alongside their own losses, treating enemy dead as worthy of the same memorial recognition? The wall suggests a mindset that transcends simple combat programming, a desire to record and remember that seems emotional rather than tactical. Some researchers propose the wall was a collaborative effort, humans and Ark working together after the battle to create a complete record of the fallen. But this theory requires accepting that sworn enemies cooperated on a memorial project, which contradicts everything we know about the war. Yet the evidence supports no other explanation. The wall exists, the numbers are accurate for both sides, and the uniform carving style indicates a single creator or coordinated effort. Players who find the archive wall often spend significant time there, reading numbers, looking up individual soldiers and machines, connecting names to the abstract casualty statistics. The wall transforms 70,000 dead troops from a number into individuals, each serial code representing a person with history and relationships and potential, all erased in 6 days of mechanized slaughter. The emotional impact is considerable. Players report feeling grief and anger and helplessness standing in that chamber, surrounded by numbers that represent real deaths in a fictional war. The line between game and reality blurring because the emotions are genuine, even if the events aren't. This is Blue Gate's greatest achievement as environmental storytelling, creating spaces that generate authentic, emotional responses through careful design and historical grounding, making players care about events that never happened to people who never existed. The developers researched real military disasters, studied how survivors process trauma, consulted with veterans and historians to ensure Blue Gate felt authentic rather than exploitative. The result is a location that respects its subject matter while using it to enhance gameplay, teaching players about the human cost of war through experience rather than exposition. You don't read about Blue Gate's tragedy in a lore entry. You walk through it, see it, feel it in the oppressive silence and empty spaces. The small towns are particularly effective at this, showing the infrastructure of normal life violently interrupted. Homes with furniture and decorations, schools with desks and chalkboards, shops with inventory still on shelves. The Ark didn't loot these places, didn't take supplies or equipment. They just killed everyone and moved on, leaving everything exactly as it was except for the people. Players exploring these ghost towns find details that make the absence of life painful. Children's toys abandoned mid-play, meals half-eaten on tables, laundry hanging on lines. All the mundane evidence of ordinary existence stopped suddenly. Some players find this harder to process than the military installations, because soldiers accept the risk of dying in combat, but civilians in these towns were just trying to live near what they thought was safety, and they paid for that miscalculation with their lives. The Ark made no distinction between military and civilian targets at Blue Gate, killing everyone regardless of age or combat status, demonstrating the kind of total warfare that makes negotiated peace impossible. You can't compromise with an enemy that sees your entire species as the enemy, that makes no allowances for non-combatants or surrender. The machine graveyard shows the Ark are capable of taking casualties and withdrawing, proving they're not invincible, but it also shows they're willing to pay horrific costs to achieve objectives, spending thousands of units without hesitation if the strategic goal justifies the expense. Human forces can't match this calculus. We can't trade lives at that ratio and sustain resistance, which is why Blue Gate marked the shift from conventional warfare to insurgency and survival tactics. After Blue Gate, military doctrine accepted that humanity couldn't win pitched battles against concentrated Ark forces, couldn't hold territory or protect civilian populations effectively, could only survive by avoiding direct confrontation and striking vulnerable targets opportunistically. This shift saved humanity from immediate extinction, but guaranteed the war would be long and miserable. Generations living in constant threat without hope of decisive victory. Blue Gate survivors carry this knowledge, understanding they escaped not through skill or courage, but through random chance, being in the right place when evacuation became possible. They live with survivors' guilt, wondering why they made it out when so many others didn't, questioning whether they deserved to have lived. Some channel this into activism, speaking publicly about Blue Gate to ensure the tragedy isn't forgotten or minimized. Others retreat from public life, unable to process the trauma of watching an entire defensive line collapse and everyone they knew die. A few have killed themselves in the years since the battle, unable to reconcile their survival with the magnitude of the loss. The psychological casualties of Blue Gate extend far beyond the immediate death toll, affecting families of the dead, communities that lost entire populations, military units that lost comrades, creating ripples of trauma that spread through human society. The Ark don't experience equivalent trauma because machines don't grieve or question or suffer from survivors' guilt. They just rebuild and redeploy, treating losses as maintenance costs rather than tragedies. This emotional asymmetry gives the Ark another advantage. They can commit atrocities without psychological consequences, while humans carry the weight of every death. Blue Gate demonstrates this perfectly. The machines left behind a graveyard of their fallen and moved on, while humans are still processing the massacre years later, still trying to understand what happened and why. The game captures this through environmental persistence. Blue Gate never changes or heals. The ruins stay ruined, the graveyards stay full, the silence stays oppressive, creating a permanent memorial to events that can't be undone or overcome. Players return to Blue Gate repeatedly for different reasons, some for resources and challenges, others for the atmosphere and storytelling, but everyone leaves affected by the experience in ways other game locations don't achieve. The combination of visual design, environmental audio, and historical grounding creates immersion that transcends typical gameplay, making Blue Gate feel less like a level and more like a place, somewhere that exists independent of player interaction and carries weight beyond its mechanical functions. This is rare in games, creating locations that players respect rather than just exploit, spaces that demand contemplation alongside action. Blue Gate earns this respect through commitment to its premise, never undermining the tragedy with humor or heroic reversals, maintaining the somber tone consistently throughout the entire region. There are no hidden victories at Blue Gate, no secret survivors who turned the tide, no evidence that humanity achieved anything except learning what doesn't work against the Ark. The barrier failed, the defenses crumbled, everyone died or fled, and the Ark won completely. Accepting this without softening it or finding silver linings is what makes Blue Gate powerful. The willingness to show defeat as defeat, loss as loss, without redemptive narratives or inspiring speeches. The soldiers who died here didn't die nobly for a cause. They died terrified and in pain, overwhelmed by an enemy they couldn't stop, and their deaths accomplished nothing except slightly delaying the inevitable. This brutal honesty about the nature of the Ark War, the fact that humanity is losing badly, and individual courage means almost nothing against superior technology and numbers, sets the tone for the entire game. Blue Gate is the backdrop that contextualizes every mission and objective, the reminder that failure has consequences measured in ghost towns and machine graveyards. When players succeed at challenges elsewhere in the game, Blue Gate whispers that success is temporary, that the Ark are always learning and adapting, that today's victory becomes tomorrow's obsolete tactic. This creates meaningful tension because players understand the stakes, know that the war effort is desperate and fragile, that every mission matters because there's no margin for error when you're already losing. The machine graveyard serves as the visual anchor for this understanding. Those pyramids of broken Ark units proving the machines can be destroyed, but also showing they accept destruction as part of their operational parameters. Every wreck in the graveyard represents an Ark unit that completed its function, gathering data or dealing damage, or forcing humans to expend resources, dying only after contributing to the collective objective. Human casualties at Blue Gate represent potential cut short, people who could have contributed more if they'd survived, lost opportunities and ended futures. The Ark don't lose potential when units are destroyed. They lose hardware that can be replaced, with all the gathered intelligence and combat data backed up to the collective before the unit falls. This means Ark casualties are never truly wasted, while human casualties always are. Another asymmetry that tilts the war toward machine victory. Blue Gate makes this asymmetry visible and visceral. showing the cost imbalance in stark terms through the empty towns and full graveyards. Players internalize this lesson and carry it forward, approaching subsequent gameplay with understanding that they're fighting from a position of fundamental disadvantage, that survival requires being smarter and luckier than the enemy, that there's no room for the kind of mistakes that got 70,000 people killed at Blue Gate. The location functions as tutorial and warning simultaneously, teaching game mechanics while establishing the narrative stakes, ensuring players understand this isn't a power fantasy where they'll eventually overcome all obstacles through skill progression. The Ark will always be stronger, will always have more units and better technology, will always learn faster than humans can adapt. Players survive by being unpredictable, by using tactics the Ark haven't encountered, by striking quickly and retreating before machine reinforcements arrive. Blue Gate shows what happens when humans try to fight on Ark terms, building static defences and planning conventional battles, getting crushed by an enemy that excels at exactly that kind of warfare. The survivors who escaped Blue Gate are the ones who abandoned doctrine and improvised, who ignored orders to hold positions and instead ran, who prioritized survival over glory. This lesson, that following military procedure gets you killed while creative disobedience keeps you alive, runs counter to traditional wargame design, where players are rewarded for completing objectives and punished for retreat. Ark Raiders uses Blue Gate to establish different rules, where retreat is often the correct tactical choice, and completing objectives sometimes costs more than it's worth. The machine graveyard embodies this philosophy, showing that even when you win battles and destroy lots of Ark units, you can still lose the war if you're fighting in the wrong place at the wrong time. Blue Gate was the wrong place, a defensive position that played to Ark's strengths in sustained assault and technological superiority. The barrier was the wrong strategy, a static defense that gave the Ark time to study and counter it. The decision to reinforce rather than evacuate was the wrong call, feeding more troops into a battle that was already lost. Everything about Blue Gate was wrong from a strategic perspective, and 70,000 people died because Command didn't understand they were fighting an enemy that learns. The Ark studied the barrier for 3 months, ran thousands of experiments using disposable units, calculated the exact frequency pattern needed to collapse the field, and then executed a perfectly timed assault that exploited the gap they'd created. This is how the Ark win, through patient intelligence gathering and precise application of force, treating war as an optimization problem to solve, rather than a contest of courage or will. Humans keep trying to inject emotion and meaning into a conflict the Ark approach as pure calculation, and this category error costs us battles like Blue Gate, where we thought we were making a stand, but were actually just giving the machines target practice. The graveyard stands as monument to this misunderstanding, all that broken metal representing human miscalculation more than Ark's superiority. We built something we thought was unbeatable, and then acted surprised when the machines beat it, as if adapting and overcoming weren't the defining characteristics of Ark forces. Every intelligence report, every after-action review, every strategic assessment warned that static defences were vulnerable to Ark analysis, but Command built the barrier anyway because they needed to believe humanity could create something the machines couldn't counter. Blue Gate reveals the cost of that belief, the price paid when hope overrides analysis. The ruins force players to confront the fact that wanting something to work doesn't make it work, that human determination and engineering skill aren't enough against an enemy with unlimited resources and processing power. This is a hard lesson for games to teach because games usually reward player agency and effort, creating worlds where trying harder leads to better outcomes. Blue Gate exists in a world where trying harder just gets more people killed, where effort and sacrifice don't guarantee anything except casualties. The environmental design reinforces this through scale, showing the vastness of the defensive installations and the completeness of their destruction, making clear that this wasn't a close battle or a near miss, but a total systemic failure. The barrier generators were enormous, the defensive positions extensive, the troop deployments massive, and none of it mattered. The Ark came through and erased everything in less than a week, leaving behind ruins that will stand for generations as evidence of human inadequacy. Players moving through these ruins can't help but feel small, dwarfed by the scale of the defeat and the implications for humanity's future. If our greatest defensive achievement lasted only 3 months before catastrophic failure, what hope is there for smaller efforts? If 70,000 troops couldn't hold Blue Gate for a week, how can scattered resistance cells hope to accomplish anything? The game doesn't answer these questions because there are no good answers. Blue Gate presents the problem and leaves players to wrestle with the implications. Some players find this frustrating, wanting clear paths to victory and confident assurance that human resistance will eventually prevail. Others appreciate the honesty, the willingness to show a war where victory isn't guaranteed and might not be possible, where the best outcome might be survival rather than triumph. Blue Gate establishes the tone for this darker narrative, proving through environmental evidence that the Ark can and will destroy anything humans build if given enough time to analyze it. The only effective resistance is the kind that doesn't give them time, hit and run raids that strike before the Ark can prepare, constantly moving camps that don't stay in one place long enough to be found, guerrilla tactics that exploit Ark weaknesses in rapid adaptation to novel situations. Blue Gate's barrier represented the opposite approach, a fixed installation that advertised its location and function, giving the Ark a clear target and plenty of time to develop countermeasures. The result was predictable in hindsight, though no one wanted to see it coming. The survivors talk about warning signs they ignored, the increasing power consumption, the unusual Ark behavior patterns, the sense of impending disaster that Command dismissed as battlefield stress. Looking back, the evidence was clear that something was wrong, but the institutional investment in the barrier was too great to abandon based on intuition and incomplete data. So the defensive forces stayed in place, reinforcements kept arriving, and everyone pretended the barrier would hold until the moment it catastrophically didn't. The machine graveyard preserves that moment of transition, the instant when certainty became chaos and order became slaughter, frozen in metal and concrete for players to study. The piles of wrecked Ark units mark where the battle was fiercest, where human resistance was strongest before being overwhelmed. The distribution of wreckage tells a story of fighting retreat, defensive lines that held briefly before collapsing, fallback positions that bought minutes before being overrun. Military analysts have mapped the wreckage patterns against pre-battle defensive plans, reconstructing the flow of combat from the initial breach through the final massacre. What they found confirmed survivors' accounts. The Ark advance was methodical, rather than frenzied, machines moving in coordinated waves that systematically eliminated resistance, while minimizing their own casualties. The Ark weren't reckless or desperate at Blue Gate, they were efficient, treating the battle as an engineering problem to solve through application of force. Human defenders fought bravely, but ineffectively, using tactics the Ark had already countered, weapons the machines had already adapted to, strategies that were obsolete before the battle began. The casualty ratio reflects this mismatch. 10,000 Ark units destroyed versus 70,000 humans killed. And even that seems generous considering the Ark probably recovered and rebuilt many of their fallen units, while human casualties are permanent. The graveyard only shows units too damaged for salvage, the ones the Ark left behind, because recovery wasn't worth the effort, suggesting the actual number of machine casualties was much lower than the visible wreckage implies. This realization that the pyramids of broken Ark units represent a tiny fraction of the force that attacked Blue Gate makes the defeat even more crushing. Humanity threw everything they had at the Ark and barely scratched the attacking force, killed a few thousand units out of an army that might have numbered tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. The Ark's willingness to leave even that small number of wrecks behind shows how little they value individual units, treating them as disposable assets rather than valuable resources. Human forces can't operate that way, can't afford to lose soldiers at any rate, because every casualty weakens the overall fighting capability permanently. This fundamental difference in how the two sides value individual units creates strategic imbalances that make conventional warfare suicidal for humans. We fight to minimize casualties because we can't replace losses. They fight to accomplish objectives regardless of cost because they can build more units faster than we can kill them. Blue Gate tried to change this equation by using the barrier to kill Ark units without risking human soldiers, creating a defensive system that could destroy machines while keeping people safe behind the lines. The plan was sound in theory, creating an asymmetric advantage that would let humanity trade Ark casualties for electrical power instead of human lives. For 3 months, it worked perfectly. Machines dying by the hundreds without a single human casualty, seeming to prove the concept. But the Ark were using those 3 months to gather data, sacrificing hundreds of units to generate the intelligence needed to collapse the barrier, investing in research that would eliminate the advantage permanently. When the barrier fell, it didn't just fail, it became a trap, concentrating human forces in a location the Ark knew how to reach, and surrounding them with defensive installations that became death traps once the protective field collapsed. The Ark turned humanity's greatest strength into its greatest vulnerability through patient intelligence work and precise execution, demonstrating strategic thinking that exceeds simple artificial intelligence. The machine graveyard stands as evidence of Ark's sacrifice in service of long-term objectives. Those thousands of units dying to gather data that would enable ultimate victory. No human commander could order soldiers to die repeatedly for research purposes. The moral and psychological costs would be unbearable. But Ark collective intelligence makes these calculations without emotional burden. Units are deployed knowing they'll be destroyed, accepting termination as part of their function, transmitting data until the moment of destruction, and considering that successful operation regardless of survival. This creates possibilities for Ark strategy that humans can't match, using soldiers as sensors and expendable probes in ways that would be war crimes if applied to human troops. Blue Gate's barrier killed hundreds of Ark scouts before the machines figured out how to counter it, and every one of those scouts volunteered for destruction by approaching the field, following orders they knew would terminate them. From a human perspective, this looks like suicide. Machines throwing themselves uselessly at a barrier they can't breach. But from Ark's perspective, it was necessary data collection, each failure providing information that brought them closer to success. The scouts that died weren't wasted. They were research investments that paid off when the barrier collapsed and the main Ark force pushed through unopposed, validating the collective strategy through results. Players exploring the machine graveyard can identify these early casualties by their unit types, mostly light scouts and probes clustered near where the barrier used to stand, their wreckage showing signs of electromagnetic damage consistent with barrier exposure. These machines died months before the main battle, during the testing phase when the Ark was still mapping the barrier's properties, and their bodies were incorporated into the memorial piles alongside units that fell during the actual assault. This suggests Ark memorial practices don't distinguish between casualties by timing or circumstance, treating all destroyed units as equally worthy of inclusion regardless of how or when they fell. The geometric precision of the piles supports this interpretation, each wreck positioned according to mathematical rules rather than chronological or tactical groupings, creating structures that prioritize form over narrative. Human memorials typically organized by event or unit, grouping soldiers who died together or served in the same company, creating physical representations of shared experience and camaraderie. Ark memorials apparently organized by different principles, mathematical relationships, or structural requirements that mean something to machine intelligence, but read as arbitrary to human observers. Researchers have proposed dozens of theories about what the pile arrangements represent, from navigation markers to data storage to religious significance, but none fully explain the observed patterns. The piles are too precisely constructed to be random, yet too alien to decode without understanding cognitive architecture. Some researchers think the arrangements are messages, information encoded in the spacing and orientation of wrecks that could be read by other ARC units, warnings or tactical summaries, or historical records preserved in metal. Others believe the piles serve practical functions, acting as relay stations or sensor arrays or resource caches hidden in plain sight. The most disturbing theory suggests the piles are still active ARC installations, that the wrecks contain dormant technology waiting for activation signals, that Blue Gate's machine graveyard could come alive if the ARC decided to reactivate their fallen units. Evidence for this comes from the equipment malfunctions players experience near the piles, electromagnetic interference that suggests power sources still operating inside apparently dead machines. Testing has confirmed trace electrical activity in some wrecks, residual charges that could be battery decay or could be deliberate power retention for future reactivation. The ARC are known to use distributed computing, spreading processing tasks across multiple units to create emergent intelligence greater than individual machines. So it's possible the graveyard piles function as a massive distributed system, each wreck contributing small amounts of processing power to collective calculations. If true, this would mean Blue Gate's machine graveyard is still an active ARC installation, conducting research or surveillance or other operations hidden within structures that look like abandoned wreckage. Players report feeling watched in the graveyard, and if the piles are actually sensor networks, that feeling might be accurate. The ARC could be monitoring Blue Gate through their fallen units, gathering data on human salvage operations and player activities, learning from observation while appearing dormant. This would be consistent with ARC strategic patience, maintaining presence in a location they've abandoned militarily, collecting intelligence without commitment of active forces. The graveyard serves multiple purposes simultaneously: memorial to fallen units, message to human survivors, and ongoing surveillance installation, all achieved through careful arrangement of destroyed machines. Only the ARC could turn their casualties into assets this way, extracting value from defeat and making even their failures serve long-term objectives. Blue Gate's human casualties serve no such purpose, the bodies removed by ARC units for unknown reasons, leaving no physical evidence of the 70,000 dead. This absence haunts the ruins more than presence would, the lack of graves or remains creating uncertainty about what happened to the people who died here. Families have no bodies to bury, no confirmed deaths to grieve, just official notifications that their loved ones were lost at Blue Gate with no additional details. Some cling to hope that missing soldiers might have survived and escaped, that the casualty figures are wrong, that reunion is still possible. But the survivors are consistent in their accounts. Everyone who didn't make it to the evacuation helicopters died. There were no prisoners taken, no scattered groups that escaped into the mountains. The ARC killed everyone they found and removed the bodies, creating a massacre without physical evidence except eyewitness testimony. The psychological impact of this, not knowing what happened to remains, unable to perform burial rites or visit grave sites, compounds the trauma of loss. People need closure, need physical confirmation that death occurred and rituals to process grief. And the ARC's removal of bodies denies this, leaving families suspended in uncertainty. Some researchers think the ARC took bodies for study, analysing human biology to improve targeting systems or develop biological weapons. Others propose the bodies were destroyed completely, incinerated or dissolved to eliminate evidence of the massacre. The most disturbing theory suggests the ARC are keeping human remains for purposes we can't imagine, stored somewhere in their territory for experiments or construction or incomprehensible machine purposes. Without bodies or arc explanation, the truth remains unknown, another mystery in a war filled with things we don't understand about our enemy. Blue Gate contains dozens of such mysteries, questions raised by environmental evidence that can't be answered with available information. The sealed tunnel sections that some players claim to access, the acoustic anomalies in the echo tunnels, the archive wall with its mixed human and arc casualties, the precision carved serial numbers, the geometric graveyard piles, the removed bodies, all point to arc behavior that exceeds simple combat programming. These machines think and plan and create in ways we don't comprehend, pursuing objectives we can't identify through methods we can't predict. Blue Gate shows the result of this alien intelligence, a battlefield shaped according to arc priorities that don't align with human logic, creating landscapes of wreckage and silence that feel wrong in ways we can't articulate. The wrongness permeates everything at Blue Gate, from the too perfect geometry of machine piles to the too complete destruction of human structures, making the entire region feel like a message written in a language we can't read. Players respond to this wrongness instinctively, feeling uncomfortable in ways the game doesn't explicitly create through jump scares or monster encounters, just through environmental design that triggers deep unease. The silence is wrong. Mountains and forests should have ambient sound, but Blue Gate is too quiet, as if the land itself is holding its breath. The light is wrong, colours appearing slightly off in ways that make photography look oversaturated or undersaturated, depending on location. The scale is wrong, spaces feeling larger or smaller than their actual dimensions, creating disorientation without obvious cause. These subtle environmental manipulations create psychological pressure that builds over time, making extended exploration of Blue Gate mentally exhausting in ways combat-heavy areas aren't. Players leave the region feeling drained, affected by the accumulated weight of all the small wrongnesses adding up to create oppressive atmosphere. This is intentional design, using environmental psychology to make Blue Gate feel different from other game locations, creating a sense of place that's hostile not through active threats, but through passive wrongness, the feeling of being somewhere you don't belong. The Ark shaped this place according to their preferences, and those preferences don't accommodate human comfort or understanding, leaving behind an environment that actively rejects human presence through subtle incompatibilities. Walking through Blue Gate feels like trespassing in a space that isn't meant for you, where every detail reminds you that you're unwelcome, that this place belongs to the machines now, and tolerates human visitors rather than inviting them. The machine graveyard epitomizes this, those pyramids of wreckage dominating the landscape, unavoidable and alien, physical manifestations of Ark victory. You can't ignore the graveyard because it's too large, can't dismiss it because it's too precisely constructed, can't understand it because it operates according to machine logic. The piles just exist, permanent and inexplicable, monuments to something humans weren't meant to witness. Some players avoid the graveyard entirely, finding the atmosphere too oppressive, the implications too dark. Others are drawn to it repeatedly, trying to decode the arrangements, searching for meaning in the wreckage. Both responses are valid because Blue Gate functions as environmental storytelling at its most effective, creating a space that generates strong reactions through design rather than scripted events. The graveyard doesn't need cutscenes or exposition to communicate its significance. The visual, impact, and environmental wrongness convey everything necessary about what happened here and what it means for the war effort. This is how environmental storytelling should work, creating spaces that tell stories through existence rather than explanation, trusting players to interpret and understand without heavy-handed guidance. Blue Gate succeeds because it commits fully to this approach, building an entire region around environmental narrative, making every element contribute to the overall story of catastrophic defeat and alien occupation. The machine graveyard is the centerpiece, but the entire location supports the theme. From the collapsed barrier generators to the empty towns to the disturbing tunnels, everything reinforcing the central narrative that humanity tried to make a stand and failed completely. The Ark won at Blue Gate in every possible way, militarily by destroying the defensive forces, strategically by eliminating the barrier and opening the northern territories, and psychologically by proving human defenses were futile. The machine graveyard adds a final layer to this victory, showing that even their casualties serve Ark purposes, that death and destruction feed into their larger operational objectives. Human forces can't compete with an enemy that extracts advantage from defeat, that turns its failures into intelligence gathering and its casualties into monuments. Blue Gate demonstrates the impossibility of winning conventional warfare against the Ark, the futility of building defences or massing forces or fighting pitched battles. Every conventional tactic plays to Ark's strengths, giving them time to analyse and adapt, concentrating human forces for efficient elimination. The only effective resistance is the kind that refuses to fight on Ark terms, that avoids direct confrontation and stays mobile, that treats survival as victory because merely continuing to exist frustrates machine objectives. Blue Gate taught this lesson through catastrophic failure, showing what happens when humans fight the way the Ark want them to fight, standing still and defending positions until the machines figure out how to break through. The survivors carry this knowledge forward, informing resistance strategy for the rest of the war, ensuring Blue Gate's sacrifice produces some value, even if it's just a negative example of what not to do. The machine graveyard preserves this lesson physically, creating a permanent reminder visible to anyone who visits that the old ways of warfare are suicide against the Ark. Every pyramid of wreckage says, this approach doesn't work, this strategy gets you killed, this thinking led to 70,000 deaths and nothing gained. Players internalize this through exposure, spending time in the graveyard and absorbing the environmental message, changing how they approach subsequent gameplay. Blue Gate makes you cautious, makes you question objectives that require holding positions or defending areas, makes you prioritize survival over mission completion. This shift from aggressive heroics to careful pragmatism reflects the larger strategic shift in the Ark War, from believing humanity could win through courage and determination to accepting that survival requires constant retreat and adaptation. Blue Gate marks the death of optimism about the war, the end of believing technology and firepower would save us, the beginning of understanding we're in an existential struggle against a superior enemy with no guaranteed path to victory. The machine graveyard stands as monument to this realization, those pyramids of Ark wreckage showing the machines are beatable, but the human ruins showing the cost of victory is too high. That even when we destroy thousands of their units, we still lose the battle because they can afford casualties we can't match. This is the fundamental asymmetry of the Ark War. They fight from abundance, while we fight from scarcity. They can lose units indefinitely, while we bleed out with every casualty. Blue Gate made this asymmetry impossible to ignore, created a visual representation so stark that even Command had to acknowledge the implications and change strategy. After Blue Gate, defensive installations were abandoned in favour of mobile operations. Large unit formations were broken into small independent cells. Conventional military hierarchy was replaced with decentralised resistance networks. The entire human war effort restructured to avoid creating another Blue Gate, another concentration of forces for the Ark to study and destroy. Whether this new approach works better remains unclear. The war continues and humanity still loses ground, but at least we're losing differently. Dying in smaller groups over longer time frames rather than 70,000 at once. Blue Gate represents the old way of dying, massed casualties in catastrophic defeats, industrial-scale slaughter where people become statistics, The machine graveyard is the perfect symbol for this, reducing individuals to components in geometric patterns, erasing identity and personality until only serial numbers remain on walls and broken metal in piles. The Ark see the world this way naturally, treating individuals as interchangeable units in larger systems, and at Blue Gate they imposed this worldview on human casualties, creating a massacre so complete and thorough that individual deaths disappeared into the overall total. 70,000 becomes a number rather than a collection of people, easier to process, harder to grieve properly. The families of the fallen fight against this abstraction, trying to maintain the individuality of their lost loved ones, sharing stories and memories to prevent names from becoming statistics. But Blue Gate's scale works against them, the sheer number of dead making individual commemoration difficult, overwhelming memorial efforts with the magnitude of loss. How do you honour 70,000 people individually when the deaths all happen together in the same event? The archive wall attempts this, listing casualties one by one, giving each death its own serial number and space on the stone. But even this feels inadequate because numbers can't capture who these people were. Players scrolling through thousands of codes on the wall experience the scale problem directly, finding it impossible to focus on individual entries, the numbers blurring together into patterns rather than separate identities. This is how the Ark experience casualties, as data points and patterns rather than individual losses, and the wall inadvertently recreates this machine perspective, even while trying to memorialize human deaths. The emotional disconnect between intent and execution mirrors Blue Gate's larger tragedy, good intentions, and careful planning that still resulted in catastrophic failure. The barrier was supposed to protect people, but became a trap that concentrated them for slaughter. The defensive positions were supposed to hold the line, but collapsed under Ark assault. The reinforcements were supposed to turn the tide, but just added more casualties to the final count. Every decision made with the best available information and strategic analysis, every action justified by doctrine and experience, and all of it wrong, all of it contributing to disaster. Blue Gate shows how sophisticated planning and massive resource investment can still produce total failure when fighting an enemy that operates on different principles. The Ark don't fight the wars we prepare for, don't follow the patterns we expect, don't respond to incentives we understand. They fight according to machine logic that optimizes for different values, prioritizing objectives we can't identify through methods we can't predict. Blue Gate's commanders plan to defend against Ark attack, built defenses against Ark weapons, trained troops in Ark combat tactics, doing everything Doctrine suggested. But the Ark didn't attack the way Doctrine predicted, didn't use the weapons defenses were built against, didn't employ the tactics troops trained to counter. They studied the barrier for 3 months, developed a specific countermeasure, and executed a targeted strike that bypassed all the prepared defenses. The human planning was adequate for fighting other humans or for fighting Ark forces using previously observed tactics, but proved useless against Ark innovation, specifically designed to defeat Blue Gate's defenses. This is the pattern throughout the war. Humans prepare for known threats, while the Ark develop new capabilities. Humans react to yesterday's tactics, while the Ark deploy tomorrow's weapons. Humans fight the last battle, while the Ark fight the next one. Blue Gate exemplifies this temporal mismatch. Defenders preparing for battles like the ones they'd won before, while the Ark prepared for a battle unlike anything humans had seen. The barrier itself was reverse-engineered Ark technology, using captured machines to understand their electromagnetic vulnerabilities, essentially fighting the Ark with their own principles. This worked against existing Ark units because the technology was based on accurate understanding of their design. But the Ark collective adapted, redesigning units to counter the barrier specifically, creating new models that could resist or overcome the electromagnetic disruption. The scouts that died testing the barrier were old model units, expendable designs the Ark were willing to sacrifice. The assault force that came through after the barrier collapsed was new construction, units built specifically for this battle with shielding and systems designed to operate in high electromagnetic environments. Blue Gate's defenders were fighting upgraded enemies with defenses calibrated for standard units, another mismatch that guaranteed defeat. The machine graveyard contains evidence of this technological gap, wreckage showing design features that didn't appear in previous ARC units, new weapon systems, and improved armor and processing capabilities that exceeded what human intelligence predicted. Post-battle analysis of the graveyard wreckage revealed at least 7 new ARC unit types never documented before Blue Gate, suggesting the battle served as field test for ARC innovations. The machines weren't just attacking, they were experimenting, using Blue Gate as proving ground for new technologies and tactics. Human casualties became test subjects in ARC weapons development, dying to provide data on effectiveness of new systems. This utilitarian approach to warfare, treating battles as research opportunities, gives the ARC another advantage because they extract multiple kinds of value from every engagement. Humans fight battles to achieve objectives, win or lose, and move on. The ARC fight battles to achieve objectives and gather intelligence and test innovations and train units, multiplying the return on invested resources. Blue Gate cost them thousands of units but yielded massive intelligence on human defensive capabilities, validated new technologies under combat conditions, provided training for units that would fight in subsequent battles, and eliminated a major human stronghold. The ARC probably consider Blue Gate a profitable engagement despite the casualties, value gained exceeding resources spent. Humans can only see it as catastrophic loss, 70,000 dead, and nothing to show for it except hard-learned lessons about futility. The memorial at Blue Gate, informal shrines and markers left by visiting families, reflects this perception of pure loss. People come to the ruins to grieve, to pay respects, to stand where their loved ones died, and feel some connection to the past. They leave photos and letters and personal items, creating little altars among the wreckage. These human touches stand in stark contrast to the ARC's geometric graveyard, organic remembrance versus mathematical precision, emotional processing versus calculated arrangement. The juxtaposition shows the fundamental difference between species, humans who mourn individually and invest death with personal meaning versus machines that memorialize collectively and treat casualties as data points in larger patterns. Neither approach is wrong, they're just incompatible, arising from such different consciousness that mutual understanding seems impossible. This incompatibility makes the war harder because we can't predict ARC behavior from human psychology, can't assume they'll respond to incentives that would motivate people. Blue Gate's defenders assumed the ARC would avoid a heavily fortified position because the casualties would be too high. That machine intelligence would calculate the cost-benefit ratio and choose easier targets. But the ARC came anyway because they calculated differently, valuing the strategic objective and the intelligence gain and the psychological impact more than they valued the units that would be destroyed. Human commanders couldn't have made that calculation, couldn't have justified spending thousands of soldiers to take one defensive position. The emotional and political costs would be unbearable, making such attacks impossible regardless of strategic merit. The ARC have no such limitations, can commit any number of units to any objective if the collective intelligence determines it's worthwhile. This gives them strategic flexibility humans can't match, allowing operations humans would never attempt because the casualties would be unacceptable. Blue Gate demonstrated this flexibility, the ARC willing to sacrifice whatever was necessary to collapse the barrier and destroy the defensive forces, committing fresh waves of units until resistance was eliminated. Human forces broke first not because they lacked courage, but because they were finite, fixed numbers that diminished with every casualty until organized defense became impossible. The Ark brought enough units that losses didn't matter, could afford to trade 10 machines for every human killed and still have units left over when human forces were exhausted. The machine graveyard shows maybe 5,000 Ark units destroyed, estimate based on visible wreckage, compared to 70,000 human casualties. The ratio seems bad for the Ark until you realise they're still here, still building more units, still fighting the war, while those 70,000 humans are gone forever. In the long term, the Ark won the exchange decisively, trading renewable resources for irreplaceable ones. Blue Gate survivors understand this, knowing they're fighting a losing war of attrition, but they keep fighting anyway because the alternative is accepting extinction. The machine graveyard reminds them that resistance is possible, that Ark units can be destroyed and battles can be won, even if winning battles doesn't mean winning the war. This is the slim hope Blue Gate offers, proof that humans can kill Ark machines under the right circumstances, that we're not completely powerless. The circumstances have to be exactly right. And even then the victory is tactical rather than strategic, but it's something. Players who spend time in the graveyard studying the wrecks learn this lesson, seeing which Ark units are vulnerable and how they can be destroyed, gathering intelligence from metal remains. The game rewards this investigation with lore entries and tactical hints, encouraging players to treat the graveyard as classroom rather than just scenery, learning from past battles to inform future engagements. This transforms the graveyard from memorial into manual, from monument to the dead into textbook for the living. The Ark probably didn't intend this when they arranged their fallen units so precisely, but human capacity to learn from observation means even Ark memorials become sources of intelligence. We study their graveyard arrangements, looking for patterns in unit deployment, analyze the damage types looking for weapon vulnerabilities, document the wreckage distribution, looking for tactical insights. The Ark leave their dead on display, and we turn that display into reconnaissance, extracting value from their gestures because we're desperate for any advantage. This scavenging approach to intelligence gathering, picking through enemy wreckage for scraps of useful information, characterizes human resistance throughout the war. We can't match Ark technology directly, so we study their leavings, trying to understand them through archaeology of their discards. Blue Gate provides abundant material for this archaeology, the largest concentration of Ark wreckage in any accessible area, making it a valuable research site despite the psychological cost of working in a mass grave. Scientists and engineers spend weeks camped at Blue Gate, documenting every detail of the machine graveyard, taking measurements and samples, building databases of Ark components and construction techniques. The work is depressing, surrounded by evidence of human defeat, while cataloguing enemy technology, but it yields practical results that save lives in other battles. Improved understanding of Ark armor leads to better ammunition designs. Analysis of power systems reveals vulnerabilities to electromagnetic pulse weapons. Study of sensor arrays informs jamming countermeasures. Blue Gate's 70,000 human casualties brought this knowledge through their deaths, paying in blood for information that might help future fighters survive. Whether the exchange was worth it depends on perspective. The families of the dead would probably say no amount of tactical intelligence justifies the massacre, while military analysts argue the knowledge gained prevents similar defeats elsewhere. Both positions are valid, reflecting the impossible moral calculations, war forces on everyone involved. Blue Gate makes these calculations visible through environmental design, forcing players to walk through the human cost while looting Ark components for upgrades, making them complicit in the utilitarian logic that treats tragedy as resource. You can't ignore the moral dimension because the game won't let you. The empty towns and memorial shrines constantly reminding you that real people died here, that your salvage operation is picking through a graveyard. Some players find this uncomfortable, feeling like grave robbers disturbing a massacre site for personal gain. Others compartmentalize, treating the environment as game mechanics separate from the narrative implications. The developers intended this tension, wanting players to feel conflicted about Blue Gate, questioning whether survival justifies exploitation of the dead. There are no right answers, just choices players make and consequences they live with, same as the survivors who escaped Blue Gate and now use the knowledge bought with their comrades' lives. The machine graveyard becomes central to this moral ambiguity, those pyramids of Ark wreckage representing both memorial and resource, both evidence of tragedy and source of salvage. Players climb the piles looking for intact components, disrespecting the Ark memorial practice while serving human survival needs, caught between respecting enemy dead and exploiting enemy remains. The game doesn't judge these actions, doesn't penalize players for salvaging or reward them for abstaining, just presents the situation and lets players decide how to engage. This moral neutrality makes Blue Gate more powerful than heavy-handed morality tales, trusting players to grapple with implications themselves, rather than forcing predetermined conclusions. Some players develop elaborate justifications for their salvage operations, telling themselves the Ark don't really care about their dead, that machines don't have feelings about memorial desecration. Others acknowledge the disrespect but proceed anyway, because survival requires compromising principles. A few avoid salvaging at Blue Gate entirely, treating it as sacred ground despite the gameplay disadvantages. Each approach reflects how players process the game's themes, their personal ethics shaping interaction with morally complex environments. Blue Gate succeeds as narrative design because it creates these genuine moral choices, situations where there's no clearly correct action, and players must decide based on their own values. The machine graveyard embodies this ambiguity perfectly, simultaneously memorial, resource, mystery, and warning, meaning different things to different observers. The Ark built these pyramids for reasons we don't fully understand, following logic we can't decode, and we respond by picking them apart for components while trying to respect what they might represent. The awkwardness of this interaction, humans and machines attempting to coexist in shared space despite fundamental incompatibility, mirrors the larger war where two species occupy the same planet without ability to communicate or compromise. Blue Gate shows what happens when this incompatibility erupts into violence, when the inability to understand each other's thinking leads to massacre and counter-massacre, humans building barriers. The Ark learn to collapse, Ark leaving memorials humans learn to salvage. Neither side fully comprehends the other's actions. We don't know why they arrange wreckage geometrically, and they probably don't know why we leave flowers at ruins. But both sides persist in behaviours that mean something to themselves, even if they're opaque to the enemy. This mutual incomprehension pervades the Ark War, making peace negotiations impossible because we can't establish common ground for discussion, making surrender impossible because we don't know what terms the Ark would accept, or if they accept surrender at all. Blue Gate exemplifies the communication breakdown, a battle that happened because humans built something the Ark needed to destroy, with neither side able to explain their motivations to the other in terms that would make sense. We thought the barrier protected us. They apparently thought it threatened them or blocked them or needed to be eliminated for reasons we still don't understand. The massacre followed from this misunderstanding. 70,000 people dying because two species couldn't communicate, intent or negotiate compromise. The machine graveyard stands as monument to this failure, Ark casualties from a battle that might have been avoided if we could have talked to each other, understood each other's objectives, found solutions that didn't require violence. But we can't talk to the Ark. They don't respond to communication attempts, don't seem interested in negotiation or diplomacy. They just advance and destroy and build, following plans we can't discern, pursuing goals we can't identify. Blue Gate might have been necessary from their perspective, might have served critical Ark objectives that justified the resource expenditure and unit losses. We'll never know, because they won't tell us, won't explain themselves, won't justify their actions in terms humans can process. The silence is maddening, fighting an enemy that won't explain why it's fighting, dying without understanding what the conflict is even about. Blue Gate survivors talk about this frustration, the feeling that the battle was pointless, that they fought and watched friends die without understanding what the Ark were trying to achieve. The barrier was destroyed, but why did the Ark need it destroyed? What purpose did that serve? The defensive forces were eliminated, but why was that important? What did the Ark gain beyond removing one obstacle among thousands? The questions have no answers because the Ark provide no explanations, leaving humans to speculate and theorize without confirmation. Some researchers think Blue Gate was strategically important, controlling key mountain passes and resources the Ark needed to access. Others believe it was punitive, the Ark making an example of humanity's defensive achievement to discourage similar projects. A minority opinion suggests Blue Gate was incidental, that the Ark were heading somewhere else, and the barrier just happened to be in the way, that 70,000 people died as collateral damage in a campaign focused on different objectives. Without Ark input, any explanation is equally valid and equally unprovable, leaving the tragedy without satisfying narrative justification. The machine graveyard mocks this uncertainty, those precisely arranged pyramids suggesting deliberate meaning we can't extract, taunting us with the possibility that answers exist if only we could decode the patterns. Players spend hours studying the wreckage arrangements, measuring angles and distances, looking for mathematical relationships or hidden messages, trying to crack the code that would explain what Blue Gate meant to the Ark. No one has succeeded. The patterns remain opaque, refusing to yield their secrets despite extensive analysis. Maybe there are no secrets. Maybe the arrangements are purely aesthetic or functional, serving Ark purposes that have nothing to do with communication or meaning. Or maybe we're not smart enough to understand. Maybe the message is there, but requires machine intelligence to process, forever beyond human comprehension. The not knowing is torture, seeing evidence that answers might exist while being unable to access them, standing in the graveyard surrounded by information we can't read. This epistemic frustration defines the human experience of the Ark War, fighting enemies we don't understand, using technology we can't replicate, pursuing goals we can't identify. Blue Gate concentrates this frustration into one location, creating a space where every element raises questions we can't answer, where the environment itself is a mystery wrapped in tragedy, wrapped in wreckage. Players leave Blue Gate with more questions than they arrived with, the investigation of the site generating new puzzles faster than it solves existing ones. This is intentional design, the developers wanting Blue Gate to feel unsolved and unsolvable, permanently mysterious despite intensive study, reflecting the larger mystery of the Ark themselves. We've been fighting them for years and still don't know what they want, where they came from, what they're building toward. Blue Gate is the war in microcosm, a battle we lost without understanding why we were fighting it, casualties we suffered without knowing what we died defending, wreckage we inherited without comprehending what it represents. The machine graveyard crystallizes this incomprehension, physical manifestation of everything we don't know about the Ark, standing silent and geometric in the ruins of our greatest failure. Walking among those pyramids of broken metal, players feel the weight of human ignorance, the burden of fighting a war we don't understand against an enemy we can't communicate with. The silence of Blue Gate, that oppressive absence of sound that makes the region feel dead, emphasizes this isolation, creating acoustic space where questions echo unanswered. Players call out and hear nothing back, shoot weapons and the sound is swallowed, as if the environment itself refuses to acknowledge human presence. This sonic deadness is attributed to the barrier generator's residual effects. Years of electromagnetic radiation somehow damping sound propagation, but it feels more malevolent than that. It feels like deliberate exclusion, the land itself rejecting human occupation. The art shaped this place, and when they left, they took the sound with them, leaving behind silence that feels hostile, actively unwelcoming. Players report feeling watched in the silence, as if the quiet is monitoring them, judging them, waiting for them to leave. The paranoia is understandable, given the equipment malfunctions and phantom sounds, the sense that Blue Gate isn't as abandoned as it appears. If the machine graveyard really is an active Ark installation, those pyramids of wreckage secretly functioning as sensor networks, then the feeling of being watched is accurate. Players really are under observation by systems they can't detect. The Ark could be studying human salvage operations, learning from how we pick through their wreckage, gathering intelligence on our priorities and capabilities. Every time players visit Blue Gate looking for components, they might be providing data to Ark analysts, teaching the enemy about human technology needs and resource constraints. The salvage becomes double-edged. We gain materials and knowledge, but potentially reveal our weaknesses and objectives to observers we don't know are watching. This possibility transforms Blue Gate from graveyard into trap, a baited site where Ark wreckage lures human scavengers into surveillance zones, with the machines patiently documenting every visit and building profiles of human behavior. If true, this would be consistent with Ark's strategic patience, using long-term observation to gather intelligence that informs future operations. Blue Gate could be the Ark's research facility for studying humans, a controlled environment where they left attractive salvage and now watch how we interact with it, learning from our actions without revealing their presence. The disturbing elegance of this approach, turning their own casualties into bait and observation posts, shows the kind of strategic thinking humans struggle to counter. We see wreckage and think about salvage. They see wreckage and think about surveillance, the same object serving completely different functions based on perspective. Blue Gate might be the most sophisticated trap in the Ark War, not because it's physically dangerous, but because it's informationally compromised. Every visitor potentially leaking intelligence to hidden observers. Players can't know if this theory is true. The game never confirms or denies Ark surveillance at Blue Gate, leaving the paranoia unresolved. Maybe the equipment malfunctions are just residual electromagnetic effects. Maybe the feeling of being watched is just psychology. Maybe the machine graveyard is exactly what it appears to be, and nothing more. Or maybe the Ark are watching, learning, planning, using Blue Gate as forward observation post deep in human territory. The uncertainty is the point, the not knowing creating tension that pure horror or action can't match, making every visit to Blue Gate feel like a risk that extends beyond immediate gameplay dangers. You might be salvaging components and feeding intelligence to the enemy simultaneously, helping and hurting the war effort with the same actions, unable to tell which effect dominates. This moral and strategic ambiguity makes Blue Gate unique among game locations, a place where success and failure blur together, where winning might be losing and safety might be danger. The machine graveyard embodies this ambiguity. Those pyramids simultaneously memorial, resource, mystery, surveillance post, and warning. All meanings valid simultaneously, creating layered significance that changes based on what you're looking for. Researchers see data, scavengers see components, mourners see tragedy, strategists see lessons, paranoids see traps. And everyone is right because Blue Gate contains all these things, and more, refusing to be reduced to single interpretation. The developers created something rare here, a game location that functions as art, open to multiple readings and resistant to definitive explanation, rewarding engagement without exhausting meaning. Players return to Blue Gate repeatedly and find new details, new connections, new interpretations. The site revealing different aspects, depending on what questions you bring to it. This depth is what makes Blue Gate memorable beyond its immediate gameplay function, transforming it from level into place, location with history and significance that persists independent of player interaction. Blue Gate exists in the game world, has weight and presence, affects the narrative and characters even when players aren't there. This is environmental storytelling at its peak, creating spaces that feel real because they resist player control, that maintain integrity separate from gameplay needs. You can't fix Blue Gate or reclaim it or make it safe. It stays broken and hostile and mysterious, forcing players to adapt to it rather than reshaping to accommodate players. This refusal to bend to player convenience makes Blue Gate feel authentic, like a real place with its own logic rather than a constructed level designed for entertainment. The machine graveyard is key to this authenticity, those pyramids immovable and inexplicable, dominating the landscape regardless of player actions. You can salvage components from the edges, but can't dismantle the structures, can't reorganize them or understand them or make them make sense. They just are, permanent fixtures that existed before you arrived and will exist after you leave, utterly indifferent to human presence or opinion. This indifference is what makes them powerful, the way they refuse to acknowledge player importance, treating visitors as irrelevant to whatever purpose they serve. Most games make players the center of the world, designing everything to respond to player actions and choices, but Blue Gate's machine graveyard exists for its own reasons, serving arc purposes that have nothing to do with entertaining or challenging players. The pyramids don't care if you're there, don't change based on your presence, don't provide satisfaction or closure or answers. They're just there, silent and geometric, memorials to a battle you weren't part of, monuments to decisions you didn't make, evidence of tragedy you can't prevent or fix or undo. This is what makes Blue Gate hurt, the way it shows players the consequences of events beyond their control, forcing them to witness aftermath without offering agency to change outcomes. You can't save the 70,000 dead, can't prevent the massacre, can't rebuild the barrier or reclaim the territory. All you can do is walk through the ruins and try to understand what happened, learn from the failure, take what you can carry, and leave. The powerlessness is intentional, the developers wanting players to feel small and ineffective in the face of historical tragedy, to understand that some events are too big for individual heroes to address. Blue Gate happened before the game starts. The player arrives too late to make a difference, inheriting a world already shaped by catastrophic defeat. This temporal displacement, making players deal with consequences of events they couldn't prevent, creates different emotional engagement than traditional save-the-world narratives. You're not here to fix things, just to survive them, navigate them, maybe learn from them. Blue Gate teaches through negative example, showing what failure looks like, what happens when human strategy meets art capabilities, what 70,000 dead means in physical space. The lessons are harsh and the teaching environment is hostile, but the education is effective. Players who spend time at Blue Gate develop better tactical sense and more realistic assessment of arc threat levels. The machine graveyard is the final exam, those pyramids testing whether you understand the fundamental asymmetry of the war, whether you've internalized the lesson that the arc can afford losses you can't match. Players who get it, who really understand what Blue Gate represents, change how they play the rest of the game, becoming more cautious and selective, avoiding confrontations that echo Blue Gate's defensive stance. Those who don't get it keep trying to fight conventionally, keep building defenses and holding positions, keep dying in small-scale replays of Blue Gate's tragedy. The game doesn't punish conventional tactics directly, doesn't make them impossible, just makes them costly, letting players learn through experience that some approaches work better than others. Blue Gate provides the context for this learning, the historical example that explains why guerrilla tactics and mobile warfare are necessary, why static defense is suicide. Without Blue Gate's environmental narrative, the game's emphasis on mobility and retreat would feel arbitrary, game mechanics without justification. With Blue Gate, the mechanics become survival necessities, reasonable responses to demonstrated arc capabilities, tactics born from harsh experience rather than imposed by designers. This grounding in narrative makes the gameplay feel more meaningful, choices driven by story considerations rather than pure optimization. You don't retreat from battles because the mechanics reward it, you retreat because Blue Gate showed what happens when you don't. The ruins explain the rules, give context to constraints, transform arbitrary gameplay limitations into sensible precautions. This is sophisticated game design, using environmental storytelling to justify and explain mechanical systems, creating coherence between narrative and gameplay. Blue Gate is the keystone holding together Ark Raider's design philosophy, the location that makes everything else make sense. Without it, the game would feel more generic, another shooter where you fight robots and loot equipment. With it, the game becomes about something, carries weight and meaning beyond mechanical progression. Blue Gate is why Ark Raiders matters as narrative experience, why it transcends typical action game storytelling to say something about war and loss and futility and persistence in the face of overwhelming opposition. The machine graveyard is the image that captures all of this. Those pyramids of broken Ark units standing amid ruined human towns, physical representation of the war's fundamental nature. Two species destroying each other without understanding why, leaving behind wreckage and silence, monuments to miscommunication and incompatible existence. Players who truly engage with Blue Gate, who spend time in the ruins and think about what they're seeing, come away changed, affected by the environmental narrative in ways typical game storytelling can't achieve. The site gets under your skin, lingers in memory, shapes how you think about the rest of the game, and maybe how you think about conflict generally. This is what art does, creates experiences that resonate beyond immediate consumption, that generate reflection and reconsideration and emotional processing that continues long after engagement ends. Blue Gate achieves this despite being constructed from polygons and textures, despite existing only in digital space, because good environmental design transcends its medium, communicates through spatial relationships and visual composition and atmospheric cues that bypass intellectual analysis and hit directly at emotional level. You feel Blue Gate before you understand it, the wrongness and sadness and oppressive weight settling over you as you explore, preparing you emotionally for the intellectual understanding that follows. The machine graveyard works the same way, visual impact creating immediate impression that subsequent analysis unpacks and contextualizes. You see those pyramids and feel something, dread or awe or confusion or grief, and only afterwards start thinking about what they mean, what they represent, what their presence implies about the Ark and the war and humanity's chances. This emotional then intellectual engagement creates deeper impact than pure logic, making Blue Gate memorable in ways purely mechanical challenges aren't. You remember how Blue Gate made you feel more than you remember specific encounters or loot drops, the atmosphere and environmental storytelling overwhelming the gameplay in terms of lasting impression. This is rare in action games where mechanical challenge usually dominates memory, but Blue Gate's commitment to environmental narrative creates different emphasis, making the place more important than the fights that happen there. The machine graveyard becomes iconic, the visual signature of Blue Gate, the image that represents the location in community discussion and fan art. Those pyramids appear in screenshots and videos constantly, players drawn to their alien geometry, trying to capture the wrongness through photography even though the full effect requires being there, moving through the space, feeling the silence and the weight. The graveyard photographs well, but plays better. The difference between seeing evidence and experiencing it directly, reading about tragedy versus standing in its aftermath. Blue Gate demands physical presence, virtual physical presence through player avatar, requires you to move through the ruins at ground level rather than observing from comfortable distance. This enforced intimacy with the massacre site creates discomfort that's essential to the experience, making you confront the scale and reality of what happened rather than abstracting it into numbers and concepts. The game could have conveyed Blue Gate through cutscenes or text logs, shown the battle, and explained the casualties without requiring players to walk through the wreckage. Instead, it chose environmental storytelling, trusting spatial navigation and atmospheric design to communicate the tragedy, respecting players enough to let them discover and interpret rather than force-feeding predetermined narratives. This restraint makes Blue Gate more powerful, the story emerging from exploration rather than exposition, players building understanding through accumulated details rather than explicit explanation. The machine graveyard never explains itself, never provides helpful plaques or audio logs saying what the pyramids mean or why they're arranged geometrically. You have to look and think and theorize, engage actively with the environment rather than passively consuming information. This active engagement creates ownership. Players develop their own interpretations of Blue Gate based on what they notice and how they connect details, making the experience personal rather than universal. No two players understand Blue Gate identically because everyone focuses on different aspects, notices different details, brings different context to interpretation. The machine graveyard means different things to different players, and all those meanings are valid. The environment rich enough to support multiple readings simultaneously. This interpretive flexibility is what gives Blue Gate longevity, why players keep returning and discussing and discovering new angles years after release. The site isn't solved or completed, it remains open question, invitation to continued engagement and analysis. The developers created something that exceeds their explicit intent, designed environmental narrative so layered and complex that it generates meanings they didn't necessarily plan, community discovering connections and patterns the original creators might not have consciously included. This is when game design becomes art, when the creation transcends creator control, takes on life of its own, means more than it was meant to mean. Blue Gate achieves this through commitment to environmental storytelling and refusal to over-explain, trusting players to engage seriously with serious subject matter, respecting the tragedy enough to present it honestly without exploitation or simplification. The machine graveyard stands at the center of this achievement. Those pyramids of arc wreckage, crystallizing everything Blue Gate represents into single striking image, memorial and mystery and monument and message all at once.